बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम। उम्मीद करती हूँ कि आप सब जो मेरे व्यूवर्स हैं, जो मेरी आवाज़ इस टाइम पे सुन रहे हैं और जो मेरे जितने भी लेक्चर्स जितने भी मैंने प्रीवियस दिए हैं उन सब में उन्होंने इंटरेस्ट लिया, उन्होंने सपोर्ट किया, उन्होंने मेरे जो काम को सराहा, उन सब का मैं बहुत ज़्यादा शुक्रिया अदा करती हूँ। और आगे भी उम्मीद करती हूँ कि इंशाल्लाह नेक्स्ट भी आप लोग मेरी बहुत ज़्यादा हेल्प करेंगे ताकि मैं अपने जितने भी लेक्चर्स हैं वो अच्छे से उनको डिलीवर करूँ और आगे तक उनको पहुँचाऊँ। इससे पहले कि मैं अपनी वीडियो स्टार्ट करूँ, मैं आप सबसे रिक्वेस्ट करती हूँ कि मेरी जो वीडियोस उनको ज़रूर लाइक किया करें और मेरे चैनल को भी ज़रूर सब्सक्राइब करें। और जो भी आप लोगों को कोई कमेंट वगैरह करना है या मेरी वीडियो से रिलेटेड जो भी आप लोगों के क्यूरीज हैं वो आप लोग मुझे कमेंट बॉक्स में ज़रूर पूछ सकते हैं। चलें जी, विदाउट टाइम वेस्ट किए हम आज अपना नया जो है वो टॉपिक उसको स्टार्ट करते हैं, जो कि हमारा नावल चल रहा है अ पोर्ट्रेट ऑफ द आर्टिस्ट एज अ यंग मैन। Now let us discuss about its general introduction. So first of all, I am reading from its title. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is a very curious and unusual title for a novel, and at first sight, the articles in this title seem to be placed rather arbitrarily, but a little consideration would reveal that the title is a very appropriate one and that the articles are exactly right. James Joyce himself warned clearly that the last four words in the title were significant and should not be ignored. As a matter of fact, this is exactly what was done by some of the earlier critics of the novel. Explaining the significance of the title, William M. Scott emphasized that the novel gives us the portrait of the artist and not just any artist. A further problem, however, arises about the words the artist. Does it mean Joyce himself? And is the novel to be regarded as the autobiography of the author? Or is it that Joyce has made the typical artist the subject of his novel? A remark that Joyce made to a friend of his would tend to make the novel a self-portrait. I haven't let this young man off very lightly. Have I? Many writers have written about themselves. I wonder if any of them has been as candid as I have. Most of Joyce's early readers and critics looked upon the novel as as a self-portrait, including some of the early reviewers. Many of its incidents closely parallel incidents in Joyce's life. What is more, Joyce's school fellows at Clongowes Board School became Stephen's school fellows at Clongowes Board under their real name. Men still walking Dublin streets also walked through the portraits bearing their own names, and numerous well-known Dublin figures, including Joyce's mother and father and some of his university friends, were immediately recognizable beneath their pseudonyms. A small wonder that the early reviewers saw the book as thinly disguised autobiography. Contrary evidence. Evidence was later available that there were important qualifications to the statement that the material of the novel is the life of Joyce himself. It was made clear by Joyce's brother and some of the Dublin contemporaries of the writers that many of the details and even some of the major incidents in the novel were not based on the life of the author himself but were taken from the careers of other people. J.F. Bryan, critic, the model for Cranley, has stated that it was he, not Joyce, who discussed with the Dean of Studies the art of lighting fires. David Shelley has pointed out that Joyce did take off the rector of Belvedere in the school play. Though Stephen is urged to do so, he does not as a source of information about Joyce's life. Therefore, the portrait is only partially reliable. One may wonder if the same may be said of its reliability as a source of information about Joyce's thinking. To ask whether the portrait is autobiographical is to ask the wrong question. For Stephen, both is and is not the young Joyce. James Joyce both is and is not the artist as a young man. The evidence of Joyce's practice suggests that he shared the view expressed by Stephen in his discourse on the forms of art. Stephen says in the fifth chapter of the portrait, the personality of the first artist at first are a cadence, are a mood, and then a fluid and lambent narrative. Finally refines itself out of existence, impersonalizes itself, so to speak. The aesthetic image in the dramatic form is life, purified in and reprojected from the human imagination, motif and symbol. Joyce makes a significant use of motif and symbol in the portrait. According to William M. Scott, the more one read this novel, the more one feels impressed by both the subtitles and the pervasiveness of his use of motif and symbol. The most innocent of sentences becomes charged with meaning. One sees it in the context of the related elements. When, for example, we read on the second page of the text that the evening air was pale and chilly, and after every charge and third of the footballers, the greasy leather orb flew like a heavy bird through the grey light. We may recognize simply and effective descriptive sentences only when we read the final phrases in the light of the many other references to flying birds and flying men. When we recognize that the mood greasy takes on particularly unsavory connotations as the novel progresses, and when we discover that chili is the first in the subtly insinuated a series of references to heat and cold, which gradually prepare us for the knowledge that Stephen is coming down with influenza. Only when we recall all of these matters do we grasp the full import of this innocent looking piece of descriptive prose. Composition: a portrait of the artist as a young man, essentially the story of Joyce's own break with the Catholic Church and discovery of his true vocation, was published in 1916 at the end of a process of gestation covering many years. Joyce had begun an autobiographical novel while still in his teens, and he perse- uh, persevered with it until it was 150,000 words long and could be regarded as approximately half finished. About 1908, he decided to rewrite the book on a smaller scale and different method, and it appears probable that the greater part of the original manuscript was then destroyed. The only considerable fragment certainly preserved, which has been published under Joyce's original title of Stephen Hero, is rather longer than the whole perfected work, but corresponds only to the final third of it. The technique of Stephen Hero is objective, explicit, and ploddingly documentary. It is the only one of Joyce's works self-evidently and at once to rebut Wyndham Lewis's charge that here is a writer stimulated only by ways of doing things and not by things to be done. It thus has some claim to be considered as a substantive work with an illuminating place in the development of Joyce's writing, and it certainly possesses the curious interest of closely defining the whole basic structure of Joyce's personality. Nevertheless, the mature portrait is of altogether superior artistic significance. Its opening sentences exhibits the new technique. Once upon a time, and a very good time, there was a moo cow coming down along the road, and this moo cow that was coming down along the road met a nice little boy named Baby Tuku. Symbolic themes. The mind of and consciousness of Stephen are interesting not only in themselves but also because they have a symbolic significance. Our knowledge of Stephen is now going to come to us mediated through his own developing consciousness. And that consciousness is to be the theater of whatever drama the book attempts to present. And at the same time, a territory sufficiently broad for the exercise of the vigorous naturalism which Joyce has been learning from continental masters. Yet, with the quiet, bare naturalism, it is no longer to be content, and on the second page, we come upon him putting unobtrusively into operation a different sort of machinery. The Vances the Vances lived in number 7. He had a different father and mother. They were Eileen, father and mother. When they were grown up, he was going to marry Eileen. He had under the table. His mother said, "Oh, Stephen will apologize." Dante said, "Oh, if not, the eagles will come and pull out his eyes." Pull out his eyes? Apologize? Apologize, pull out his eyes. The whole portrait is an apologia. At the same time, its cardinal assertion is that Stephen will not apologize, rather, he awaits the eagles. Joyce's eyes, moreover, were in actual fact threatened from the first. Presently, in the portrait, Stephen, as a schoolboy, is going to be unjustly punished as a consequence of defective vision. The master who beats him makes an observation suggesting that this guilt is to be seen in his eyes. The complex of ideas thus established remains with Stephen and is several times resumed in Ulysses in a manner fully intelligible only to a reader equipped with the relevant memories of the portrait. This technique of weaving elusive symbolic themes percurrently through the strongly realistic fabric of his writing is something that Joyce is to exploit more and more. His prose at length becomes a vast hall of echoes, and one fatally adopted. The toiling inquirer must feel to the conflicting voices of scholiasts. Eventually, Joyce appeared to have enjoyed playing up to his commentators Stephen's experiences to the extent that the book recounts the early life of an artist. It is not unique. The development of a young man destined to be artist was already in Britain, as on the continent, a prolific field of fiction, but this scarcely qualified the large originally of the portrait, which is as much landmark in the English novel as is Joseph Andrew or Middlemarch or The Way of All Flesh. We have only to think of that novel's lines of a representative young man, Roderick Random, Tom Jones, David Copperfield, Arthur Pendennis, Richard Feverel, to realize that Stephen's Dedalus is presented to us with a hitherto unexemplified intimacy and immediacy. It is true that this is achieved at some cost to the vitality of the book as a whole. Here, as later in parts of Ulysses, we are locked up firmly inside Stephen's head, and there are times when we feel like shouting to let out. What Stephen takes for granted, we have to take for granted too. And as he is aware of other people, only as they affect his own interior chemistry. There is often something rather shadowy about the remaining personages in the book, but the picture is always clear and hard in its exhibition of Stephen's successive predicaments. The imaginative and unathletic small boy, hard pressed by their narrow orthodoxies and hovering brutalities of a Jesuit boarding school, his growing realization of his family drift into squalor, and the pride and arrogance which he progressively summons to his aid, the overwhelming sense of sins into which the severity of Catholic doctrine precipitates him upon the occasion of his untimely sexual initiation, and the breaking of his nerve, and the phase of anxious and elaborate religious observance, his stumbling but implacable advance through reverie and through conversation with whatever acquaintances will listen upon an understanding of the realm of art and his elected place in it, the crisis of his being with church and family, and the exalting moment of revelation and dedication on the strand, all these are vividly realized and rendered experiences. Thus, though the subject of the book is not unique, its form and treatment are certainly unique. Variety of style. J.I.M. Stewart draws attention to the fact that the variety of styles used in portrait makes it entitled to be regarded as a museum of old and new style. Next only to Ulysses, in the portrait, Joyce's abundant that aggressively frugal and monotonous prose pervasive in Stephen's hero, out of which he had evolved the highly expressive, scrupulous manners of Dubliners. Vocabulary, syntax, rhythm are now boldly varied to accentuate the contours of the underlying emotions, and Jesse is thus beginning to deploy his resources as a master of initiative forms. Ulysses, considered in point of prose style, is to reveal itself quite frankly as a museum displaying as in a series of showcases all the old ways of using English and a great many new ones as well. The portrait, although in some degrees looking forward to this, renders as overriding impression of unity, since each of his styles reflect one facet of Stephen, who is a highly unified creation. He chronicled with patience what he saw, we are told, detaching himself from it and tasting its mortifying flavor in secret. This Stephen is best represented in some of the conversation which is as in Dubliners are based upon an ear and intellect so alert as to combine a maximum of the significant statement with a minimum of apparent selection. The early scene in which Stephen, father, and Mrs. Riordan curl over Irish politics during dinner on Christmas Day is Joyce's early masterpiece in this kind. When Stephen ceases to be merely a recording intelligence and responds actively to the challenge of a world he finds so largely inimical, the style reaches out at once for weapons and armors, its whole tone becoming an extension of Stephen's most causatic and arrogant, a condemnation of Dublin which has shrunk with time to a faint mortal odour of Ireland, the old soul that eats her farrow, of her church, which is the scullery maid of Christendom. Stephen himself is a priest of the eternal imagination, and he speaks in cold, exalted phrases consonant with the whole role. Introspection. But there is yet another Stephen in the book, the Stephen who ceaselessly communes with himself on solitary walks about Dublin. It is here, it is in the style. Joyce largely employs in rendering Stephen that the success of the portrait resembles in the balance. The hazard is not the consequence of any simple miscalculation of effect. It is necessary risk involved in the complexity of what Joyce's attempts. There are always two lights at play on Stephen. In the one, he is seen as veritably possessing the sanctity and strength he claims, for he has been set aside, not of his own will, to serve the highest. In the other, he is only the eldest of Simon Douglas' neglected children, and his inspiration have the pathos he is to the son in his sister Dilly, when she shyly produces the tuttered French grammar she has brought from a stall. Moreover, he is an adolescent as well as an artist, and the emotions of adolescence are often both disturbingly self indulgent and much in excess. Of their specific precipitating occasions, expressing themselves in maudlin texts, conventional postures, phrases, and condenses caught up out of books, sometimes hovering agonizingly between sublimity and absurdity, hysteria and inspiration. It is because of all this that Stephen is represented as outrageously sentimentalizing himself and regularly clothing his poignantly felt nakedness in the faded splendors of a bygone poetic rhetoric. He meditates. He heard the choir of voices in the kitchen echoed and multiplied through an endless reverberation of the choirs of endless generations of child, and heard in all the echoes an echo also of the recurring note of weariness and pain. All seemed weary of life even before entering upon it, and he remembered that Newman had heard this note also in the broken lines of Virgil, giving utterance like the voice of nature herself, to that pain and weariness, yet a hope of better things, which has been the experience of her children in every time. Theatrical moments. Accordingly to J.I.M. Stewart, there are many theatrical moments in this part of the novel. In this kind of writing, the key is regularly pitched not to the objective scale of its occasion, but to the dimensions of that occasion as they exist at the moment for the boy. Thus, Stephen takes part in some theatricals in the presence of the girl he admires, and the situation excites and disturbs him. So we have he hardly knew where he was walking. Pride and hope and desire, like crushed herbs in his heart, sent up vapors of maddening incense before the eyes of his mind. He strode down the hills amid the tumult of sudden risen vapors of wounded pride and fallen hope and baffled desires. This streamed upwards before his anguished eyes in dense and maddening fumes, and passed away above all till at last the air was clear and cold again. Before places like this are those far more highly wrought pages of the same sort which describe the boy miserable frequenting of the brothels of the city, One of Joyce's best critics is surely wrong in speaking of purple passages that have faded considerably. They remain highly expressive, like Juliet Hysteria or Hamlet Rent and Ophelia Graves, believes J.I.M. Stewart. Stephen's true vocation. Stephen avoids making a false start as suggested by the Jesuit director. At the book's crisis, this boldly writing is employed with great skills. Stephen's coming to his true vocation is by way of successive sensuous impression, each of which has a sort of trigger action upon forces which have been building themselves up in his mind. The piety which he have evinced since abandoning and repenting his carnal sins has suggested that he is apt for the priesthood, and the question of whether he has indeed a vocation is put to them temperately and wisely by a Jesuit director. His pride and arrogance and brought into play, he is tempted by the thought of secret knowledge and power. He is tempted too, without clearly not knowing it. As an artist, the vague acts of the priesthood attract him by reasons of their semblance of reality and of their distance from it. On the threshold of the college, the director gives Stephens his hand as if already to a companion in the spiritual life. But Stephen feels the cares of a mild evening air, sees a group of young men walking with linked arms, hears a drift of music from a concertina, and these impressions are reinforced by memories of his school days. His lungs dilated and sank as if he were halting a warm, moist, unsustaining air, and he smelt again the moist, warm air which hung in the bath in clongos about the sluggish, turf-colored water. Before I proceed next, if I would request from my listeners to subscribe my channel. Obviously, what I am reading before them seems very easy, but for me it's very difficult because speaking and continuously speaking is very difficult. So if you want to give the reward of someone's effort, so please I would request to subscribe their channels and my channel as well. हम सब जितने भी लोग हैं, ठीक है, हम सब बहुत ज़्यादा एफ़र्ट्स करके जो भी हमारी वीडियोस आती हैं, ठीक है, हम उनमें बहुत ज़्यादा एफ़र्ट्स करके हम अपना पैगाम आगे तक पहुंचाने की कोशिश करते हैं. तो आप सब तमाम सुनने वाले लोगों से फिर भी एक दफ़ा रिक्वेस्ट करूंगी, यानी वीडियो को आगे कंटिन्यू करने से पहले तो मैं आप सबसे रिक्वेस्ट करना चाहूँगी कि मेरी वीडियो अगर आपको पसंद आ रही हो तो इसको लाइक ज़रूर करें और मेरे चैनल को ज़रूर सब्सक्राइब करें, जो कि एमए इंग्लिश के नाम से या मास्टर्स इन इंग्लिश लिटरेचर के नाम से जो है ना मेरा चैनल है, आप उसको ज़रूर सब्सक्राइब करें. चलें अब नेक्स्ट हम पढ़ते हैं कि आगे जो है वो स्टीफन्स के साथ क्या क्या पेश आ रहा है, या उसकी लाइफ, उसकी ऑटोबायोग्राफी, या वहाँ पे उसके साथ क्या कुछ हो रहा है. सो now come to the point. Some instinct walking at these memories, stronger than education or piety, quickened within him at every near approach to that life, an instinct subtle and hostile, and armed him against acquiescence. Yet still his mind oscillates. He is entered at the university and celebrates the occasion with comical pretentiousness in an elaborately harmonious reverie, but this in turn brings to his mind a proud cadence from Newman, whose feet are as the feet of hearts, and underneath the everlasting arms, the pride of that dim image brought back to his mind the dignity of the office he had refused. The oils of ordination would never anoint his body. He had refused. Why? The answer, the positive answer, comes as he walks on the beach. It is, in fact, the secular artist's reply to the proud cadence of Newman. He drew forth a phrase from his treasure and spoke it softly to himself. A day of dappled sea-born clouds. Moment of revelation. Stephen has made the most significant choice of his life by refusing to become a priest. According to J.I.M. Stewart, this movement marks the attainment of insight. This is Stephen Dedler's moment of revelation. He realizes that he has apprehended something beautiful. Soon he will be able to write in his diary the final truth about himself. I desire to press in my arms the loveliness which has not yet come into the world. It is only a shallow irony that would remark that this loveliness is to be represented by Leopold and Molly Bloom and Ulysses. Nor need we condemn in the name of sophisticated restraint the pitch of the prose in which this movement, a movement at once of final release and final submission, is celebrated. We find him thinking, where was his boyhood now? Where was the soul that had hung back from her destiny to brood alone upon? The shame of her wounds, and in her house of squalor and subterfuge to queen it in faded cerements and in wrath at the touch. Or where was he? He was alone, he was unheeded, happy and near to the wild hurt of life. He was alone and young and wilful and wild hearted, alone amid a waste of wild air and brackish waters and the sea harvest of shells and tangled and weird grey sunlight and gay light clad figures of children and girls and voices childish and girlish in the air. Imperfection of Stephen. Joyce was justified in claiming that he had been able to avoid the greatest temptation before a writer who makes himself the subject of a novel, that of making the depiction too idealized. His own Stephen is far more an idealized portrait. He is, as Eugene M. Bretz rightly says, far from a being a godlike hero, groping painfully towards some understanding of himself and his place in the world. He is sometimes laughable, sometimes pathetic, and nearly always what we should call difficult. Yet, despite his all too human feelings, he has the almost superhuman courage to face the world alone and a profound conviction that the artist is quasi divine. This conviction is brought out in one of the most closely written passages in the novel. The description of Stephen after the composition of his villainy, standing on the steps of the library as ash plant in the hand, watching the flight of some birds which he takes to the shallows. After observing the birds minutely, he begins to observe himself observing the birds and to think of himself as an augur in an ancient temple. As overtones of the supernatural increase in intensity, he thinks of his mythical patron, Daedalus, and then for several moments of a god who is closely analogous to Stephen. And there are his reactions, a sense of fear of the unknown, moved in the heart of his weariness, a fear of symbols and portents of the hog-like man whose name he bore, soaring out of his captivity on Oisia. Woven wings of thought, the god of writers, writing with a reed upon a tablet and bearing on his narrow ibis head the cursed moon. He smiled as he thought of a god's image, for it made him think of a bottle-nosed judge in a wig putting commas into a document which he held at arm's length. One has to remember that Thoth is a scribe of the gods, but also the god of wisdom himself, which explains why he is chosen as a god of writers. इससे पहले कि मैं अपना नेक्स्ट जो भी टॉपिक है उसकी मैं रीडिंग स्टार्ट करूँ, جس سے آپ کے نہ صرف نالج انکریز ہو بلکہ آپ کو اس جو رائٹر ہے جس کے بارے میں ہم اسٹڈی کر رہے ہیں یعنی اور اس کا ناول جو کہ پورٹریٹ آف دا آرٹسٹ ایز اے ینگ مین، جو کہ ایک بایوگرافی لگتی ہے ایک ینگ پرسن کی. اس سے پہلے کہ میں اس کی جو ہے کیا کہتے ہیں رائٹنگ اور پبلیکیشن کے بارے میں جو ہے وہ اسٹارٹ کروں ریکارڈنگ، آپ سے ایک ریکویسٹ کرتی ہوں کہ میرا چینل ضرور سبسکرائب کریں اور میری ویڈیوز کو ضرور لائک کریں، اور اگر آپ کو کچھ کمنٹ کرنا ہے میری ویڈیوز سے ریلیٹڈ یا جو چیپٹر آپ سن رہے ہیں، جو ریڈنگ آپ سن رہے ہیں اس سے ریلیٹڈ جو بھی آپ کو کمنٹ کرنا ہے تو آپ مجھے ضرور جو ہے وہ کمنٹ باکس میں آ کر جو ہے وہ کمنٹ کر سکتے ہیں. اور فردر یہ کہ مطلب جو ریڈنگ ہے یا جو لیکچر پریزنٹ کرنا ہے یا جو یہاں پر آپ لوگوں تک جو بھی انفارمیشن ہے اس ناول سے ریلیٹڈ، لٹریچر سے ریلیٹڈ، وہ آسان کام نہیں ہے. اٹس ناٹ این ایزی جاب. سو کنسیڈر ایوری پرسن ایفرٹ ایز اف یو آر ایفرٹنگ فار سم تھنگ ویری پازیٹیولی. یعنی جب آپ اپنے لیے جیسے کوشش کرتے ہیں اور جیسے آپ اپنی اچیومنٹ کے لیے ٹھیک ہے تو آپ کو دوسروں کے لیے بھی اسی طرح، کیونکہ ہر انسان ایک دوسرے سے لنکڈ ہے اس دنیا میں، ہر ایک شخص ایک دوسرے سے لنکڈ ہے، اور کہیں نہ کہیں یہ ویڈیوز آپ کے لیے ایک وسیلہ بن سکتی ہیں کہ آپ کی ضرور کامیابی ہو جس قدم پہ بھی ہے. چاہے آپ ماسٹرز ان انگلش لٹریچر کے کورس کو آپ فالو کر رہے ہیں، چاہے آپ کسی بھی سروس کمیشن کے کورس کو آپ فالو کر رہے ہیں، تو یہ ویڈیوز آپ کے لیے ایک بہت اچھا ایک سورس ہیں جس کے ذریعے جو ہے وہ آپ اپنی کامیابی کو جو ہے وہ یقینی بنا سکتے ہیں. سیکنڈلی، نہ صرف آپ کی یہ ریکارڈنگ سننے کے بعد نہ صرف آپ کی لٹریچر کے ساتھ تھوڑی انٹرسٹ جو کہ تھوڑا ہے انکریز ہوگا، بلکہ آپ کی جو کہ انگلش پڑھنے کی تھوڑی سی جو جھجک ہے، جو آپ کے اندر ہیزیٹیشن ہے، انشاءاللہ وہ بھی ریموو ہوگی. پلس پوائنٹ یہ ہے کہ آپ کو یہ ریڈنگ سننے کے بعد اس رائٹر کے بارے میں بھی بہت ساری انفارمیشن ہوگی، شاید ایسی انفارمیشن جو کہ دوسرے کینڈیڈیٹس کے پاس نہیں ہو. پلس پوائنٹ یہ ہے کہ آپ کی جو پروننسیشن آف ڈفرینٹ ورڈز ہے وہ انشاءاللہ ضرور بیٹر ہوگی. چلیں ہم اب اپنا جو نیکسٹ جو ٹاپک ہے جو کہ پورٹریٹ آف دا آرٹسٹ ایز اے ینگ مین، رائٹنگ اینڈ پبلیکیشن سے ریلیٹڈ ہے، ہم اس کے بارے میں تھوڑا سا جو ہے وہ پڑھ لیتے ہیں. اوکے، اس میں جو ہے وہ کیا کہتے ہیں کہ ہمیں جو ہے ہمیں جو یہ کرٹک ہے وہ ہمیں کیا بتانا چاہ رہا ہے. ناؤ لیٹ us start with the topic. A decade of work. A portrait of the artist as a young man belongs to the period between the short stories called Dubliners and the famous novel Ulysses. At the end of the novel, two dates appear: Dublin 1904, Trustees 1914. These dates, however, do not tell us the period of writing of the novel in its present form, but relate to the whole history of its writing in the different versions. They enclose the 10 years between the initial impulse to write an account of an artist's youth and the beginning of serial publication of the final text in the English journal The Egoist on February 2, 1914, which happened also to be Joyce's 32nd birthday. The account of the young artist's life took three distinct forms. The first form was called The Portrait of the Artist. It was written at the suggestion of Joyce's brother Stanislaus. William M. Scott describes it as a badly overwritten production of a day, a curious mixture of essay and narrative in which the young writer presented himself in what was to become the characteristic stance of Joyce and his alter egos as the embattled but ever defiant artist. The stake with flashing antlers, harried relentlessly by the powers that rule the world. The tone, like the content, fluctuates. At one moment, the reader seems called upon to identify with the gallant young man and applaud his youthful idealism. In the next, he is clearly asked to consider this idealism with ironic detachment. The result, even when viewed from the perspective of Joyce's later accomplishments is confused and unsatisfactory. It is promising undergraduate writing at its most extravagant, full of undigested notions and purple passage. At the opposite, stories which was soon to write. This essay narrative was submitted for publication to the magazine Dana early in 1904 but was rejected with the editor note that he could not print what he could not understand. Stephen's hero earlier farm. Shortly after the rejection of this early version, Joyce began to plan the writing of an autobiographical novel in which the incidents of his own life were only thinly disguised. It is possible that in the writing of this version, Joyce was influenced by the posthumous publication of Samuel Butler, The Way of All Flesh. Moreover, he must have been influenced by the autobiographical works of his favorite authors Augustine Goethe and Newman. Joyce worked on Stephen's hero for the next 3 years. A generous portion of the manuscript has survived, enough to suggest that it is indeed the apprentice work of a genuine artist. Individual incidents are treated with the skill that one might expect from the author of Dubliners. Some of the characters are presented with striking charity, but the author is much too close to his material. He cannot reject the peripheral and he cannot resist the editorial. He cannot yet give his work a artistic shape and final meaning. The portrayed final form. In the earlier version, there were to have been 63 chapters. Joyce had written 24 by the time he had reached the university phase of Stephen's life. By September 1907, he had abandoned the massive effort to wear his reader down and had selected what was to be the final form for this novel. 5 brief chapters containing incidents largely drawn from Stephen's hero but refocused so that each incident and detail would contribute significantly to the theme, the development of the young artist. The first 3 chapters had been written by April 7, 1908, after which the work was put aside for the next 6 years. It was at the intervention of Ezra Pound that the egoist agreed to publish. It is possible that when the serial publication started, the last chapter had not been completed. In any case, the last pages reached Pound during August 1915. It is probable that some parts of the still unfinished Stephen hero were destroyed by James Joyce. What appeared posthumously under the title Stephen's Hero contains only the surviving portions of the fragments. Stephen and Joyce. It is undeniable that the Stephen of both Stephen's hero and the portrait is to some extent James Joyce's himself. He has been described as the young Joyce, purified in and reprojected from the human imagination of the mature artist who must, in Stephen's words, try slowly and humbly and constantly to express out again from the gross earth or what it brings forth from sound and shape and color, which are the prison gates of our soul, an image of the beauty we have come to understand. This is what Joyce attempted to do. With the only gross matter he found suitable for the purpose, this own life as a potential artist. The flawed, impure young Joyce is the raw material from which Stephen Dedalus is treated. His experience is the raw material for Stephen's life, but both the life and the experience must be refined and their imperfections removed before they can take their proper place in a work of art. In this book, therefore, Joyce uses his own life as a framework for the novel, but feels perfectly free to revise his biography for the purposes of art or to import into it any details or incidents which will help him reveal the evolution of the artist as a young man. Different techniques. The method of Joyce used to demonstrate this evolution were novel and to many shocking. The failure of Stephen's hero, in which he had attempted to overwhelm the reader by sheer weight of what he thought to be significant incident, led Joyce's to an opposite technique. But the portrait, as finely conceived, is more than a mere selection of highlights from the earlier effort. Even those efforts, incidents which he retained, are drastically rewritten to serve new ends. Revision. In his revision, Joyce sought only to eliminate every detail which did not contribute actively to his portrait, but also to endow those details which remained with multiple significance. A consciousness, conscientious reader of contemporary literature, he was aware of and adopted techniques exploited by the continental symbolist writer. The structure of the portrait, with its interweaving of themes, symbols, and motifs, more closely resembles the structure of a poem than of a traditional novel. Plot is internalized, not Dublin or Ireland, but Stephen's consciousness is the stage on which the dramatic action unfolds. The plot of the book is Stephen's struggle for independence as a potential artist against a formidable battery of opponents who demand his allegiance. The constant voices of his father and of his master, urging him to be a gentleman above all things and urging him to be a good Catholic above all things. Another voice urging him to be strong and manly and healthy, and another voice to be true to his country and help to raise up her fallen language and tradition. In the profane world, a worldly voice would bid him raise up his father's fallen state by his labors, and meanwhile the voice of his school comrades urged him to be a decent fellow, to shield others from blame to or beg them off, and to do his best to get free days of the school. Fulfillment. The portrait is the fulfillment of the dream which Joyce cherished when he began the work in 1904. In a portrait of the artist, Joyce finally was able to carry through successfully the program which he had outlined in 1904. One suspects that he abandoned Stephen's heroes because, despite his best efforts, the past was there failing into an iron memorial aspect. He had not yet found the technique he needed to capture the individuating rhythm of that fluid succession of present which constitutes the past. In the portrait, using 19 presents grouped into 5 chapters, he seems to have done so to his own satisfaction. Comparison. There were 2 early forms before Joyce's when he wrote the portrait, but it is clear that he decided to reject both of them. The earlier versions provide interesting material for comparative study and reveal the nature of the creative process. Both versions were rejected by Joyce, and they should not be permitted to distract us from the portrait itself, which, as Joyce thought, is an artistic unity for which the other are only preliminary sketches. The early narrative essay is at best an unstructured and sometimes an incoherent sketch, and Joyce himself passed judgment on Stephen's hero. What rubbish it is! No doubt he was harsh in evaluating his rough draft, but Stephen's hero has its intermittent virtues. Clearly, however, he had no intention of publishing it, and in 1911 he would have burned the manuscript had not his sister rescued it from the fire. The portrait and Ulysses. The portrait must not be considered merely a prelude to Ulysses. Stephen Douglas is a major figure in Ulysses. The 2 books share a number of other characters, and some details of the latter books can be explained only by reference to the portrait and Dubliners. But each of Joyce's published works was intended to stand by itself, and each has proved perfectly capable of doing so. Ulysses is unquestionably far more ambitious in what it attempts and in the techniques it uses. On the other hand, there is much to be said for John V. Clare's conclusion that the portrait is Joyce's one perfect work, evenly sustained and controlled from end to end by a talent in calm dominion over its theme, its instruments, and itself. Thank you so much for bearing me up to the end. Hope so all my listeners that you like my video and you like my video till up to the end, and the very information as I have shared by reading this novel. تو آسان لفظوں میں بھی بات کرتے ہیں، کچھ انگلش کے ورڈز میں، کچھ آسان لفظوں میں، کہ میری جو جتنی بھی بات ہے وہ آپ تو لوگوں تک کمیونیکیٹ ہو سکے. میں آپ لوگوں سے یہی کہنا چاہوں گی کہ مجھے جو ہے وہ اینڈ تک جو ہے نا جو آپ نے مجھے سنا ہے، ٹھیک ہے، اور جو مجھے آپ لوگوں نے انفارمیشن پرووائڈ کرنے دی ہے اور انفارمیشن آپ لوگوں نے اپنے اندر ہوئی ہے، اس ٹائم تک آپ لوگوں کے لیے بہت زیادہ میں آپ لوگ سب کا بہت زیادہ دل سے شکریہ ادا کرنا چاہتی ہوں کہ آپ لوگ جو ہے وہ مجھے اتنا زیادہ موٹیویٹ کر رہے ہیں کہ میں نیکسٹ سے نیکسٹ جو ہے وہ ویڈیو بناؤں، اور مزید ڈے بائی ڈے گریجولی میں بہتر انفارمیشن کے ساتھ آؤں، اور ساتھ بہتر کانفیڈنس کے ساتھ اور بہتر اسٹیمنا کے ساتھ آپ تک اپنی جو بھی انفارمیشن ہے اس کو، مطلب ان ناولس کے اور ان لٹریچر کے جو بھی انفارمیشن ہے وہ میں آپ لوگوں تک ضرور پہنچاؤں. اور نہ صرف آپ لوگوں کے لیے ایک یہ بینیفٹ ہے کہ آپ لوگوں کی اسٹڈیز امپروو ہو رہی ہیں، ساتھ میں آپ کا انٹرسٹ اس میں جو ہے وہ ڈیولپ ہو رہا ہے لٹریچر میں، جو کہ ایک بہت ہی زیادہ واسٹ ہے، کیونکہ لٹریچر کا تعلق جو ہے وہ آرٹسٹک ریپریزنٹیشن آف لائف سے، یعنی صرف لائف سے نہیں ہے کہ صرف لائف کو پریزنٹ کر دیا، وہ تو بایوگرافی، لیکن اس کو اس طریقے سے پریزنٹ کیا ہے لٹریچر میں، بکس میں، ناولز یا ناولسٹ یا جو بھی رائٹرز ہیں، انہوں نے کسی بھی زندگی، کسی کا بھی جو بھی زندگی کا خلاصہ وہ اس طرح سے بیان کیا ہے کہ پڑھنے والے ضرور اس چیز سے افیکٹ ہو رہا ہے، اس کو ضرور وہ امپیکٹڈ ہو رہا ہے، ضرور وہ متاثر ہو رہا ہے کہ ایسی یہ چیزیں بلا شبہ موجود ہیں، ایسی غلطیاں یا ایسی مسٹیکس یا ایسی ایررز جو ہے وہ ہماری ہیومن بینگ کا جو ہے وہ خاصہ ہیں. واقعی یہ سب کچھ ہمارے معاشرے کا، سوسائٹی کا المیہ ہے اور حصہ بھی ہے، اور ہم سارے ان ساری چیزوں کا ایک پارٹ ہیں، اور ہم سے بھی ایسی ہی غلطیاں ہوتی ہیں. تو مطلب لٹریچر کا جو تعلق ہے وہ صرف اور صرف یوں ہی لائف کے انسیڈنٹس کو یوں ہی پریزنٹ نہیں کر دینا، بلکہ اس کو آرٹسٹکلی، تاکہ اس کا جو پڑھنے والا، جو سننے والا شخص ہے، وہ یا دیکھنے والا شخص ہے، ٹھیک ہے، وہ اس سے ضرور امپیکٹ اس پر ہو، اس کی لائف میں کچھ اچھا امپیکٹ پیدا ہو. جو اسٹڈیز وہ ایبزارب کرتا ہے اس کا مائنڈ، اس سے ضرور اس کو کچھ نہ کچھ ایسا ضرور حاصل ہو جس کی وجہ سے اس کی لائف مزید سکسیزفل. چلیں جی، ہم انشاءاللہ جو ہے وہ ملتے ہیں اپنی نیکسٹ ویڈیو میں، اس ہوپ کے ساتھ کہ ہماری ریڈنگ جو ہے وہ امپروو ہوگی اور ہماری پروننسیشن اور ہمارا نالج مزید بہتر ہوگا، اس ہوپ کے ساتھ کہ ہم ایک دوسرے کے لیے ضرور جو ہے وہ ایک ہیلپ فل میٹیریل رہیں گے، ہم ایک دوسرے کے لیے ضرور ہیلپنگ ایڈ رہیں گے. تب تک کے لیے مجھے بھی اپنی دعاؤں میں یاد رکھیے گا. میں بھی آپ لوگوں کے لیے بہت ساری دعائیں کروں گی کہ اللہ تعالیٰ میرے تمام جتنے بھی میرے وطن میں رہنے والے لوگ ہیں، میرے وطن سے باہر میرے جو بہن بھائی رہ رہے ہیں، اللہ پاک ہم سب کو جو ہے وہ جو بھی ہمارے ملک میں اس ٹائم پہ کرائسس چل رہے ہیں، اللہ پاک ہم سب کو ان سب چیزوں سے نپٹنے کی جو ہے وہ بہت اچھے سے توفیق عطا فرمائے. ہمارے ملک کے جو بھی کرائسس ہیں، چاہے وہ جاب سے ریلیٹڈ ہیں، چاہے وہ اسٹڈیز سے ریلیٹڈ ہیں، چاہے وہ جس بھی فیلڈ سے ریلیٹڈ، اللہ تعالیٰ ان سب کو جو ہے وہ کیا کہتے ہیں کہ ان سب کو ان کا خاتمہ کرے، اور اس ایمان کے ساتھ، اس یقین کے ساتھ کہ ہم جو ہے وہ انشاءاللہ نیکسٹ جو ہے وہ بہتر کریں گے اور ہم آنے والا مومنٹ کو مزید بہتر بنائیں گے. اسی ہوپ کے ساتھ میں اپنی ویڈیو کا جو ہے وہ اینڈ کرتی ہوں، اور تب تک کے لیے مجھے اپنی دعاؤں میں یاد رکھیے گا، اور اسٹے ٹیون اینڈ اسٹے بلیسڈ، اینڈ آئی ول میٹ یو ان دا نیکسٹ ویڈیو. اللہ حافظ.